There are pills all over the floor. What I'm looking at now, this is the mainstay of the Assad economy, these drugs.
Is it the end of Syria's dependence on drugs? How the revolution is transforming the global trade in narcotics. Good evening from Damascus, where tonight we focus on whether the fall of the regime is also the fall of Assad's narco-state. We are in the drug factories that funded his bloody rule. Will they all be shut down? Where will the trade move? And how will Syria replace the revenue? The new transitional government has been locked in talks today with at least one possible source of funding, Qatar. And Turkish security chiefs are also here, as what were just last week, Islamist rebels become government ministers. This city is still alive with euphoria at the overthrow of the regime, but its memory also brought the streets to a standstill today. It was the funeral of Mazen al-Hamada, the man who escaped Syria, told the world of its horrors, and returned only to be arrested and killed just as the regime fell. Thousands took to the streets as they never could before.
Also on tonight's programme, questions must be answered over the murder of 10-year-old Sarah Sharif, says the Prime Minister, after significant concerns were repeatedly raised about her care, starting within a week of her birth. Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner say they'll force councils to get more homes built. Will the Green Belt be sacrificed? And does that matter? We'll debate it. And a library in Liverpool set alight in the summer riots is reopened after a £250,000 fundraising campaign and the donation of hundreds of books, including from the Queen.
Yes, this library was burned, but 1,000 other libraries were closed by austerity, and they're all equal losses. And this one came back, and they're not coming back.
It's been called the poor man's cocaine, Captagon, the drug that funded Bashar al-Assad's brutal rule in Syria. It's an amphetamine, which in high doses induces feeling of euphoria and invulnerability. Popular with soldiers, they say it offers chemical courage and reportedly suppresses pain. And it's made the Assad family billions, more than $10 billion a year by recent estimates, money it used to shore up its crumbling dynasty. Captagon is manufactured in Syria and neighbouring Lebanon. It's then smuggled overland to Saudi Arabia, Jordan and Turkey, where a single pill, costing pennies to produce, can sell for as much as $25. And also by sea, primarily to Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE and Libya, with small amounts making their way to Europe. Let's get more on this from our international editor, Lindsay Hilson.
Krishnan, you mentioned earlier about these talks with Qatar and Turkey, and that's really important because that is the possibility of this new government coming back into the legitimate world economy. Because under the Assad regime, this country became a narco-state. Really, it was a criminal enterprise rather than a country. Not just Bashar al-Assad, his brother Maher was particularly important. He was the commander of the 4th Brigade. That was the most feared part of the army, responsible for the destruction of many towns and villages and the killing of many people. He and the businessmen associated with him were absolutely key in this drug trade. And today, we got just a glimpse of how it worked. The car in front is leading us to a place where until last week, few Syrians would dare to venture. The gate is guarded by militiamen of Syria's new Salvation government. It looks like any factory, with a shipping container for exporting the goods. This is amazing. We've been brought here by a man who doesn't want to show his face. He says that before, this was a factory making potato crisps. But after Bashar al-Assad's brother Maher seized the premises, it was used for more sinister purposes. My God. Captagon here. This one is Captagon as well. I mean, what I'm looking at now, this is the mainstay of the Assad economy, these drugs. And here, these are electronic components. My God, this is heavy. This is really heavy. This will have been worth, well, I don't know, tens of thousands. This is what kept the Assad regime going, this stuff.
The illegal drug trade was worth $10 billion a year to the regime, more than Syria's official GDP. 2 interlocked half moons on each pill show it's Captagon, an amphetamine manufactured for a few cents, retailed for $25 a pill.
This is a drug that's used all over the Gulf. It's like a clubbing drug in Saudi Arabia. And nearly all of it was made here and in Hezbollah facilities in Lebanon.
While we were looking around, the original crisp factory owner appeared.
بال 2018 تم اغتصاب المصنع واتهموني بالإرهاب وهجروني. رجعنا نحن قبل سقوط بشار الأسد ب10 أيام. يوم السقوط اجينا لهون منعونا في قوات فرقة الرابعة تبع ماهر الأسد. اعتقلنا 2 وسلمناهم للهيئة الشرعية.
We found a business card for Amer Taisir Khiti, an associate of Maher al-Assad, sanctioned for his role in the Captagon trade, and labels for a consignment of apricots destined for Dubai. But that's not real fruit, it's plastic, used to contain the pills for export.
They would put the drug in fake oranges. What they would do is they would have a plastic orange, and the orange would not be full of a normal orange segments. It would be full of those pills instead, and that was how they exported them all over the region.
We walked further in. The floor was sticky with residue. The plastic containers had melted, apparently because Assad's people had tried to burn the place down before fleeing.
I'm told that what I'm seeing here are the precursors for Captagon. Now, those chemicals could have been imported from anywhere. Some of them may have come from China, they may not. But that's what they were putting together here to turn into the drug.
In another room, we found more precursors. Some of these chemicals are also used in cleaning products. They're not illegal until combined with other ingredients to make Captagon.
مخزن للمواد الأولية اللي هي تحضير الحبوب السموم اكتشفناه وموجود بحوزتنا وسلمناه للهيئة السياسية العليا وإن شاء الله حتيجي لجنة تستلمه منا ونقوم بعملية تلفه وإحراقه.
Here's the equipment used to cook it all up. Fighters use Captagon to stay awake and aggressive. So will Syria's new rulers destroy all this? Some of their own militiamen will have used the drug. The debris of a corrupt narco state, a country run by a mafia family. But if Syria gets no aid and can't restart its legitimate economy, the temptation will be to keep the drug trade going. One of a plethora of challenges facing the revolutionaries, who say they want Syria to leave its sordid past behind.
Well, let's talk more about this with Caroline Rose, who's director of the New Lines Institute think tank. She runs projects on the Captagon trade and post-withdrawal security landscapes and regularly briefs governments, parliaments and intelligence agencies on the Captagon trade, and she joins me now from New York. Good evening. First of all, how big is this in Syria? How many factories are there like the one Lindsay managed to get into today?
First off, thank you so much for having me on. I have to say, after researching the Captagon for many years and really assessing the amount of Captagon factories like this, it's really amazing to finally see footage from inside of these facilities. When it comes to assessing just how many there are, we saw that there are numerous industrial scale factories and warehouses like these concentrated around Latakia, Aleppo, Douma, Damascus, as well as quite a few small scale factories that are quite mobile and can cross the border between Syria and Lebanon. It's very difficult to put a number on just how many there are in the south, but at least in the north, we expect that there to be over at least 10 large-scale industrial factories. It's possible, though, as this was just reported, that many of the regime's members, as well as some of their allies, tried to disassemble some of these factories as the regime was being ousted in the last few days of the offensive.
I mean, we don't precisely know what will happen to them yet, and whether they will all just be destroyed, or whether, you know, the lack of revenue in this country will force people to get them back into gear. But if we assume for a moment that they all stop, you know, does that stop the trade?
No, it does not. In fact, I think what will happen is that the Captagon trade will only complicate further. Ultimately, over the last 2 years, really, we've started to see the spillover of Captagon into neighboring transit markets, for example, like Lebanon, into Iraq, even into Turkey as well. Kuwait, there have been some signs of production and trafficking, as well as some countries that are further away. For example, in Germany and the Netherlands, there have been Captagon manufacturing centers. In Austria, there was a trafficking ring that was busted. And there's been some activity, Captagon-related activity with trafficking in Libya, as well as in Egypt. So I think that ultimately what this is going to do, it's going to push some of these criminal actors to get creative, to identify some existing networks, as well as identify new routes, new locations for production. And we'll see this large-scale spillover of the Captagon trade outside of Syria, as there is a likely crackdown on industrial-scale production. This really means that we'll see a short-term halt, or at least a pause in supply, but ultimately criminal actors will be creative. They'll try and fill that gap, especially since demand levels continue.
And as a drug, I mean, is it addictive? I mean, a lot of the fighters were thought to have used it in the field. I mean, if it stops in Syria, I mean, is it going to cause other social problems?
Certainly. I think Captagon's a very interesting drug because unlike others where you have maybe, you know, a narrowed level or a narrowed pool of demographics and user profiles, Captagon is quite large because it's got mass appeal. If you want to stave hunger, or if you're income insecure or food insecure, Captagon is very lucrative because it allows you to subsist on maybe 1 to 2 meals per day. Also, if you need to stay up late, if you're working multiple shifts, Captagon is useful for that because it allows you to stay up at night. So, you know, taxi drivers, lorry drivers, workers who are working their second or third shifts, Captagon is very lucrative to use. But also on the flip side, wealthy classes are also attracted to Captagon for recreational purposes. For example, university students flock to Captagon. Nightclub goers also flock to Captagon. And because in the region there's such a large taboo with illicit drug use, it is a very attractive drug for that region because there is a illicit history of Captagon from the 1960s to the 1980s.
Caroline Rose, thank you very much indeed. We must leave it there. Thanks for joining us. Well, the UN says humanitarian needs are growing in Syria, with thousands of people displaced across the country following the collapse of the regime. Joining me here in Damascus, Christina Bethke from the World Health Organization. The health service here, the hospitals must also be on their knees. How great is the need?
Thank you so much. Indeed, even before this crisis, we had more than 15 million people that were in need of health services, and we know at least 1.6 million have been displaced since. Just about 50% of hospitals are functional at this time when we have a great need for emergency and trauma care. And we also know that populations are on the move right now, and we have a tremendous concern about contamination with explosive ordnance.
So how can all of that be filled in the short term?
So the UN and its partners are on the ground. WHO is focused on ensuring the continuity of healthcare in this country. And we do that through working with local partners some of our priorities are not only to look at the hospital services, but also primary health care. And additionally, we see a tremendous growing need for psychological support. We're seeing families, communities, children alike exhibiting signs of trauma and distress as a result of their displacement in the conflict.
But this is also going to boil down to resource here in Syria. Now, I know you're dealing with this new transitional government, and they are clearly seeking funding from, perhaps friendly countries outside. They've got talks with Qatar and Turkey today. I mean, how urgent is it to fill that funding gap?
So even before this escalation began, more than 140 healthcare facilities, mainly in northwest Syria, were facing imminent closure as a result of lack of resources. And for the humanitarian community, we have an annual appeal for the needs, and it was only 25% funded before this all started. So it couldn't be more critical at this time.
And there could be a big influx of people. There are millions of Syrians who are thinking about coming back.
Rightly so. We do expect that, and we worry about ensuring that a health system already under strain. I mean, we had the earthquake, we've had cholera, we've had more than 500,000 people come from Lebanon during that country's crisis very recently. And now with the tremendous displacement and influx, we're quite worried about sustaining those health services and helping them be able to deliver life-saving care to people in need.
I mean, they are trying to keep their emergency services going, clearly, and organisations like the White Helmets and Violet are trying to sort of step in, but they could quickly find it's quite difficult and complicated to keep going. I mean, how far away are we potentially from sort of a breakdown in that sort of emergency care?
So the health system in most places will always endure irrespective of the level of conflict. It's a question of will people be able to access life-saving care on time at the level that they need. And indeed, there's critical things that need to come. It's not only resources. First and foremost, we need to protect healthcare workers and health facilities. We also have an urgent need to reopen the border crossings to allow those emergency supplies to flow into the country.
And now, there is still war going on in this country as well. So how does that complicate the picture in the north?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. Certainly displacement, because the more people on the move, the more strain. And again, the safety and protection of healthcare workers and health facilities is so critical. Unfortunately, we've seen across this conflict that hasn't always been protected. And so that complicates things further. And then again, the ability of the system to sustain increased strain. If we have an outbreak, if we have more displacement, it's hard to sustain those services.
Christina Bethley, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, he was the Syrian activist who became a symbol of the Assad regime's brutality. Mazen al-Hamada was one of tens of thousands detained and tortured after the 2011 uprising against Assad's rule. When he was released, he fled to Europe and told the world about the horrors he'd endured, including in a documentary called Syria's Disappeared. But 4 years ago, he was lured to return back to Syria, where he disappeared until this week, when he was found dead. Our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Porrick O'Brien, went to his funeral today in Damascus, which turned into an enormous call for justice for all the missing Syrians.
For Syrians who wanted a different kind of country, Mazen al-Hamada embodied the cause.
And how do you feel about the people who did that to you?
For Syrians who were tortured by the Assad regime, just like he was, he answered that question for all of them. Their trauma distilled into his face, into this moment.
في الله بيحسبه في قضاء بيحسبه راح أسعى إلا ما أجيبه مع المحكمة وأخذ حقي بالقانون.
Mazen's body was found on Monday. He'd been detained at Saydnaya prison. We were there, but in the chaos didn't realize what was happening. We know now. He was killed by a regime he never got to see collapse. This morning, before his funeral, we visited the hospital morgue where his body was being kept. Many of those murdered inside Saydnaya were brought here. The fridges are full. There are bodies everywhere. We were shown his. The coroner told us there were signs of torture and that he'd recently deceased. We spoke to his sister Lamia outside the morgue as the body was being wrapped for burial.
يعني فرحنا بعد ما رحل النظام بس تمنيتوا انه اخوتي يكونون معي ويفرحون تمنيتوا ابني تمنيتوا زوجي تمنيتوهم كلهم مشان يشوفون بس هم دفعوا ثمن.
Mazen was first imprisoned and tortured after joining anti-regime protests in 2011. When he was released, became an asylum seeker in the Netherlands. In 2020, returned to Syria. His sister told us why.
كان يهددوا مازن، ليش رجع مازن؟ كان على أساس هم عاملين عليه مثل يعني على أساس تسوية أو مصالحة رجع مشان يعني نطالع هذولا ونعمل تسوية وخلاص. وإذا ما تجي بدنا نقتل هذوك اللي بالسجن ونجيب بقية العائلة. فاضطر يجي.
Mazen's story is also that of so many others. So today, as his body came out of the hospital, thousands showed up. The street version of a state funeral, something Bashar al-Assad will never get. 3 days ago, this would not have been allowed. These sorts of tears would have meant detention.
This young man wasn't just the face of activism and opposition. He was also the face of the vulnerability and the trauma and the pain caused by this regime. And now it represents a call for justice too.
The regime broke him in the end, but he died believing that a new Syria would eventually emerge, where their crimes would be punished. Whether this is that Syria or not remains to be seen. At night, outside the hospital morgue his body was in, others search for loved ones' faces among the portraits of the dead, people who Mazen al-Hamada spoke for.
حق رفقاتي اللي قتلوا لو بتكلفني حياتي بدي لاحق ولا بجيبهم على القضاء.
Well, I'm joined now by Khaled al-Kurdi, a Syrian activist who was detained by the Assad regime and was a friend of Mazen al-Hamada. He has just returned to Syria for the first time since 2013 and is with me here now. And that must leave you with such mixed feelings of joy and sadness for what happened today.
Absolutely. Well, it's a kind of confused feelings indeed, because I've never seen Syria free from Assad family. I was born like in 1988. And so there's always Assad all over Syria, his pictures and his father as well. And today I don't see that, so that's amazing for me.
And you're seeing family that you haven't seen for...
Oh yeah, I've just seen my sisters after 12 years. It was very emotional indeed. And I've seen her children, 5 children. 4 of them I haven't witnessed their born.
Today on the streets was very emotional as well.
Yeah.
For Mazen's funeral.
True.
I mean, can you explain why he had become such a big figure for so many people, that so many people wanted to come out and you know, remember him?
Yeah, true, because he represents every era of the revolution. Like when there were a lot of people interested in Syria and like trying to toppling Assad regime because of what he did to us. Mazen was of the people, like one of the people were like very much protesting all over Europe. He was trying to communicate with everyone who was trying to help. I met Mazen in Amsterdam in a protest, and he just told me, hey, I want someone to translate for me because there is someone like he's going to interview him on another channel. And this is how we became friends. And then we became more than friends, honestly, because we share a lot of pain. As me, as a former detainee, and him as well, we have witnessed the same sorrows. We have witnessed the same sadness and agony. And that's why we start to talk about our experiences.
His experiences really shocked people because he was very, you know, open about the terrible things that had happened to him.
True, absolutely. Yeah, he was very much open to everyone, like about what happened to him.
I mean, why did he come back? And you must have tried to stop him.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, he was at my place like 2 weeks before he went back to here, and he was very much confused as well. Like he was somehow very much, he wasn't sure what he was gonna do, because he started to tell me everybody in the world community just failed us. And the only way to just double the Assad regime from inside and to talk to them.
To come back and be a revolutionary.
Yeah.
Right.
And I was like, this is crazy. This is maniac. You cannot do that. Already the regime. The regime took your brother, your brother-in-law as well, and also your nephew. And yeah, you know what they are. Yeah, what they are doing to them right now. So you cannot go back to that place. It's hell.
So was he in a way also a victim of the way Europe treated Syria's refugees?
Yeah. Yes. He was victim by all the international community, honestly, because we witnessed that everyone just failed us. There was not much support.
What was the failure? Just explain what the failure was, because this will be documented, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So the thing is, like at the beginning of the revolution, everyone was with the revolution, but out of the sudden, after Assad, Assad was one of the people who started ISIS, and when ISIS came, it was like Assad who was like the nice guy, the doctor and his wife, like very modern. And out of the sudden, like just people forget what happened to us just 3 years ago. And was even for me very ugly, honestly, very ugly. And to see that it was like only ISIS or Assad. This was a big mistake from the whole international community. We are not with ISIS, neither with Assad. And we felt our voices just demolished. It wasn't there, not in the media. I don't know what exactly happened. We tried to tell the people what happened to us. But everybody we weren't in the media much. Only we were talking about ISIS all the time. But what about the people that really, really needed a revolution, really needed a better Syria without Assad, without ISIS?
Khaled Al-Kurdi, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you.
Well, despite the scenes of jubilation and unity in many Syrian cities, violence has been reported in northern Raqqa, with local Arab residents apparently protesting against the Kurdish-led SDF forces who control the area. This video, reportedly from Raqqa, is said to show US-backed Syrian Democratic Forces firing weapons as protesters run at their vehicles. Later footage seems to show that those clashes are ongoing this evening. It's thought local people want the forces behind the government now in charge in Damascus to take over in Raqqa as well. Well, while the world has been focused on the seismic changes here in Syria, Israel has kept up its bombing of Gaza. Palestinian media says at least 36 people were killed this morning in strikes across the Strip. 15 died in a house where displaced people were sheltering west of Nusayrat camp in central Gaza. And in the south, 2 airstrikes killed 13 Palestinians, who doctors and Hamas said were part of a force protecting humanitarian aid trucks. Israel's military said they were Hamas fighters trying to hijack the shipment. Well, that's the news from Damascus. Now over to Kathy in London.
Thanks, Krish. Now, more building will be allowed on the Green Belt under a major shake-up of the planning rules unveiled today by the Prime Minister. Sir Keir Starmer says providing homes must take priority over nature and the environment. Local councils in England have been given mandatory targets to deliver a total of 370,000 homes a year. And if they don't, he says the government will push developments through. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, has more.
The government's piling the pressure on councils to sign off house building on a scale not seen in many decades.
Well, I've got 1.5 million homes being built.
Many councils have been told they must double their existing plans to build new homes. If the government targets are met, house building will rocket above recent completions in England, on average by 60%.
Are we going to push away the planning rules and make them clearer, as we've done today? Get away the blockers that are stopping the housing being built? Yes, we absolutely intend. For years, we've had not enough houses being built. That means that individuals and families don't have the security that they want.
Under the government's newly published plans, councils must develop house building plans that meet the new higher targets set by the government. Councils must identify what the government calls grey belt land, low-grade green belt that could be developed without great loss. Any greenbelt land will be considered for development if that's judged necessary.
Of course we want to get the balance right with nature and the environment, but if it comes to a human being wanting to have a house for them and their family, that has to be the top priority.
Over the decades, the town of Sittingbourne in Kent has already crept out over some of the fields that surround it. But for some local residents, the current development plan for new homes goes way beyond that.
These fields here would be obliterated with development and a road going all the way round across the village here, across the neighbouring villages over to the national park.
8,400 houses, so that's about 20,000 people. It's a town. People are calling it a garden village. It's a garden town.
The Borough Council here got a taster of the government's approach to planning when it got a letter from Angela Rayner 3 hours before it was about to vote to block the development on the edge of Sittingbourne.
The Secretary of State had called in these applications. As such, the committee has had the power to make a decision on this application ripped out of its hands at the 11th hour.
Labour in coalition leads the council here and voted against the plans to build on these fields.
The only bits in my constituency are right up here.
But the brand new Labour MP backs the new development.
Well, I think that if I'm honest, the way that it's gone in the last few years, nothing gets built in this country.
You've got a very slim majority, 355?
Yes.
Do you feel you're taking a bit of a risk backing this development?
I'm not going to get re-elected. The government won't get re-elected if we don't deliver the change that's needed. And honestly, right there in Sittingbourne and Sheppey, if we don't actually deliver, show that we're actually producing the homes people need, that we're actually doing things that will bring the public services.
Might as well give up.
It's making him really, really unpopular. He's going to have a real struggle getting re-elected in 4.5 years' time.
Some critics of the government's new approach say ministers should be putting more pressure on developers to build on land they're sitting on. And they argue the government won't get housing for the poorest without government money.
They're just chasing a big number without thinking through the consequences. They're putting all their eggs in one basket with planning. Quite frankly, it's much broader than that.
We will see very few affordable homes in this development. What we need is not executive homes, which is what they want to build. It's going back to old-fashioned council housing. It's social housing.
The government's got to dig into its own pockets.
Yes, we need to see social housing.
Otherwise it won't happen.
Exactly, because developers don't make enough money out of that type of housing. They're not interested.
The government's told councils they have 12 weeks to come up with a timetable for new, much bigger house building plans, as the clock already ticks on a government target it acknowledges is hugely ambitious.
Well, joining me here is Lizzie Bundred-Woodward, a planning policy manager at the Campaign to Protect Rural England, and in Leeds, Sam Stafford, who's planning director of the Home Builders Federation. Lizzie Bundred-Woodward first. The last time a government built 300,000 homes a year was back in 1969. Do you accept that mandatory targets are needed because otherwise young people simply can't get on the housing ladder?
So CPRE are really pleased that Labour government are grasping the challenge. They understand the scale of the challenge in terms of the housing crisis. However, targets for councils don't actually lead to homes being built out on the ground.
Well, they're not being built at the moment, so they've got to do something.
Absolutely, and setting these big targets is good, and it's good to have ambition, but we need to see affordable homes being built, and that's primarily the issue. The government's announcements today, there's no clear direction of travel in terms of actually building homes that young people like myself can afford.
But you're worried about the number of homes being built and what area they're being built, and it's urban sprawl all over again.
We are concerned that there's going to be nibbling away at the green belt, and really what we want to see is a brownfield first approach. So we want to see urban regenerating our dilapidated town centres. Post-COVID, many of us are used to seeing empty shops boarded up. Let's bring those shops back into use first before building on greenfield.
Right. Sam Stafford, nibbling away at the green belt, that's the problem. You know, I've heard it described today as the worst sprawl since the 50s. Do you accept that is what is going to happen now?
I think that's somewhat of an over-exaggeration, Cathy, if I may say. I think the government should be applauded for grasping two nettles that the previous government didn't do. One is that if we are going to build 300,000 homes a year, we need to plan for 300,000 homes a year, excuse me. And the calculation for doing that under the last government got to about 240 in practical effect, and we're building about 240. So in dealing with that national ambition, it gives us more than a reasonable chance of actually getting there. And the government have opened a conversation about building on the green belt, which is necessary in the longer term because there just isn't enough capacity within urban areas to meet housing need. And these are only really the sites that should be allocated in local plans if local authorities got round to adopting a local plan. This is not a presumption in favour of development, it's a presumption in favour of sustainable development.
Right. Lizzie, nibbling away at the greenbelt, you said, but there you heard from Sam that the greenbelt needs to be built on to deliver these kind of numbers. And they are saying brownfield first, government, aren't they?
Unfortunately, CPRE completely disagree, and we have research to show that there is sufficient brownfield land available across the country to build 1.2 million homes. We think that's a really good start in meeting the government's ambition for 1.5 million. Where greenbelt should be released, it should be released as part of a local plan process, and it should be strategically released, not on a site-by-site basis.
Well, what about if you answer that point about the brownfield, that you could almost get there by building on brownfield, Sam?
The last calculation I saw, Cathy, was a couple of years ago, and it was 1.4 million homes if you added up every single site on every local authority's brownfield register. But over the longer term, and planning is about the longer term, that gets you to about a third of the requirement over a 15-year period. And brownfield first, yes, absolutely. The government consulted recently on what brownfield passports may be in order to expedite the development of vacant sites in towns and cities, and that's to be encouraged. But as I say, it just won't get us anywhere near, and it won't give the plurality of choice in the market to significantly increase supply. Because if the government is going to get anywhere near 1.5 million homes, we need planning permissions in very short order. And they need to be lots of planning permissions on lots of sizes of sites in different locations.
But Sam, the grey belt, as Keir Starmer calls it, is actually the old green belt, isn't it? And it's straying very far from Keir Starmer's original definition of disused petrol stations, isn't it?
That is true. Grey belt is to be defined as land that's in the green belt and making a limited contribution to 3 of the tests of Greenbelt. Now, as I said before, arguably, if authorities like, for example, Swale was the authority featured in Gary's piece, that doesn't like, or the councillors were about to vote down a planning application for major development. So the councillors don't like that development, but they have had ample opportunity to put a local plan in place on sites and land that they do like.
Right.
And
well, let me
like
put
I said
that
before,
back to Lizzie. I mean, if the councils are wise, they can use the brownfield sites and the disused petrol stations, as Keir Starmer defined it. They don't have to build on the green belt, do they? It's down to the councils.
It's in some areas, absolutely, and in other areas, not so much. And we really think that this centralisation of the planning system is a challenge, and actually planning should be locally specific. It should be a democratic process. But the grey belt, I think, and CPRE think, is really masking a larger issue, that the homes being delivered just are not affordable for people. The government really need to grasp the nettle and set affordable housing targets, and we're really disappointed that they've reneged on the 50% affordable housing commitment that they had promised on the grey belt in the summer.
We'll have to discuss that on a whole different occasion. Lizzie Bundred-Woodward and Sam Stafford, thank you both very much. Now, a day after the father and stepmother of Sarah Sharif were found guilty of her murder, a report has revealed that 485 children were killed or seriously harmed by abuse or neglect in England in the year to April. The Prime Minister says questions must be answered over the case of 10-year-old Sarah. It can now be reported that significant concerns were repeatedly raised about her care as far back as within a week of her birth. Simeon Brown has been following the case, and just to warn you, his report does contain some distressing details.
Alongside this timeline of Sarah's childhood is a timeline of institutional failings to keep her alive. Even before she was born, social services knew that she needed protection from her father. Irfan Sharif was known to police over a decade before he and his wife Bainash Batul murdered his 10-year-old daughter.
Next week here at the Old Bailey,
Irfan Sharif, Bainash Batul and Faisal Malik will all be sentenced for their role in Sarah Sharif's death. But the big questions now are for social services, for the police and the family courts, who are all aware of Irfan Sharif's record of domestic violence and child abuse, even before Sarah was born, and yet allowed her to remain in the care of Irfan Sharif. As early as 2011, Irfan Sharif had been referred to social services alongside Sarah's birth mother, Olga. Both would be accused of domestic violence and child neglect. When Sarah was born 2 years later, she was deemed at risk and subject to care proceedings alongside other children in the family. Irfan Sharif had already been accused of attacking several women and holding a woman at knife point. On multiple occasions, Sarah was placed with foster carers, but returned to her mother in 2015 after Olga split from Irfan Sharif. But the turning point happened in 2019. Sarah alleged that her birth mother Olga had tried to drown and burn her, and the judge, familiar with years of concern about Irfan Sharif, ruled that Sarah could live with him. Despite the allegations against Irfan Sharif, Sarah's father was allowed to remove her from school and teach her at home. The question is, why did this not raise alarm bells?
This is about violence, it's about abuse, it's about making sure there's protection and safeguards for children, particularly those being homeschooled. So that's where I think the questions are.
Since the trial here, those questions are growing as more details emerge. We now know that there were missed opportunities to save Sarah, and a serious review is underway. But the concern is that Sarah's story is part of a wider pattern of safeguarding failures. In the last year, over 150 children died following abuse, and in total, there were 330 serious incident notifications where abuse or neglect is known or suspected after a child is seriously harmed. Of these numbers, over a third were babies under the age of 1. What is the threshold for intervention in families like the Sharif household? What is the threshold for saying, actually, we need to intervene and remove these children?
There are tens of thousands of children that are currently on child protection plans across England and Wales that are being managed and they are being kept safe. So I think we have to place Sarah's tragic case in that context. However, I think we have to acknowledge that the professionals that are working in this sphere have an incredibly difficult job. They are under intense pressure, but there is no doubt that the thresholds that are being applied around the country, dependent upon where you are and dependent what your assessment of the risk is and your assessment of the risk tolerances are different.
The hope is this difference can be settled for children like Sarah. For too long, child protection has been a game of roulette at a cost that is far too high to pay.
Simeon Brown reporting there. The backlog of criminal cases waiting to be dealt with by Crown courts in England and Wales hit a new record high in September. The Justice Ministry figures show it reached 73,105 at the end of that month, almost doubling in 5 years. Prosecutors say victims are facing waiting times of 2 to 5 years before a case goes to trial. Scrapping jury trials in some cases is one of the proposals ministers are considering to reduce the backlog. The first payouts from the infected blood scandal are due to reach victims in the coming days. 10 people have been offered compensation totalling more than £13 million, with thousands more applications to be processed next year. The Chancellor set aside £11.8 billion to compensate victims of the scandal, which saw 30,000 people infected with potentially deadly viruses from contaminated blood products in the 70s and 80s. Now, NHS England is warning of a tidal wave of flu hitting hospitals after the number of beds occupied by patients with flu increased by 70% in a week. It was also the busiest November on record for accident and emergency. Hospital bosses are desperate to free up beds, but some are occupied by homeless people who can't be discharged without somewhere safe to go. Our Health and Social Care editor, Victoria MacDonald, looks at how scaling up intermediate care for them could ultimately save the NHS money.
Hiya, Paul.
Good morning.
How you doing?
I'm
All right?
okay. Yourself?
Yeah, not too bad.
Good.
A meeting to assess the patient's needs. And Paul Mahoney's biggest need, not to be discharged back onto the streets.
But you're on medications for your heart stuff and that, and you have to take them regularly?
Gavin Blethen, once homeless himself, was part of the Pathway team at the Royal London Hospital. Their job to ensure Paul is safe and secure.
We have a step-down unit. This is a unit we send patients to whilst we're trying to access their housing, because you don't need to be in hospital.
Too often there is a revolving door. Homelessness, admission to hospital, discharge, homelessness, and so it continues. The charity Pathway, which has teams across England, believes the solution is intermediate or step-down care, a safe place to stay while something more permanent can be found. And that is what Gavin and Paul were discussing.
Hopefully, just at this moment in time, I need a pending open heart surgery. So I need somewhere to recover for at least a 6-week period after the operation. So that's coming along, so I need a roof for that.
Hospitals do have a legal duty to refer these patients to the local authority, but they don't always follow up, and the patient gets lost to the system.
We know with people experiencing homelessness that they have multiple issues, going on, and often multiple services working with them, but often with very poor communication between each other. So joining all of that up makes it clearly a better experience for the individual, but also makes the system much more effective.
And independent research commissioned by the charity now shows that more than 32,600 homeless patients could benefit from step-down care every year, and the saving would be more than £5,200 for each one.
I think this programme will literally bring people back to life. And there's a moral case, really, isn't there, that in a developed society like the United Kingdom, that we're seeing large numbers of people discharged to the street, large numbers of people dying on the street, and we should be better than that. But the economic case is also fundamental for the health service.
The maths is not complicated. If you have no fixed abode, you are 6 times more likely to use A&E services. You are 4 times as likely to be admitted, and you will stay twice as long.
Today's report gives the financial and the societal value of providing step-down intermediate care, but there is another issue. You take this hospital, it's full, as are hospitals right across England, and yet there are beds that have patients in them who are ready to go, but they can't because they're homeless.
This step-down house has 6 residents who stay usually for about 6 weeks, and it's run by the Housing Association, the Peabody Trust.
I slept in doorways, I lived on the street.
Kenneth Hayward, though, has been here for a year, admitted to hospital after being beaten up. He was then discovered to have tuberculosis.
You've been into hospital, you've been discharged.
Yeah.
Is this the first time that somebody has said, actually, we have this step-down care?
Yes.
What difference does that make for you?
Well, it means I have a future, doesn't it, and less anxiety, less insecurity, knowing that I will be housed soon.
The government is working on a homelessness strategy, and they told us they're putting £1 billion towards supporting services that will improve hospital discharge, but they wouldn't be drawn on the specific call to provide that step-down care that the charity says will stop patients ending up back on the streets.
Victoria MacDonald there. After the break, 4 months after it was ruined by rioters, the lights are back on at a Liverpool library, repaired and restocked after the community rallied round. Welcome back. A man has been jailed for 9 years for arson at a hotel housing asylum seekers in Rotherham during the summer riots. The judge said 31-year-old Levi Fishlock was involved in almost every arena of racist criminal conduct that day. He was part of a group shouting abuse and racial slurs. He was then seen trying to fuel the fire at the hotel, smashing its windows and attacking police. It's the joint higher sentence handed down for the riots. But one of the buildings torched during the riots was a Liverpool library. The Children's Laureate described the attack as an assault on the truth. But the lights are now back on. Frank Cottrell-Boyce was among the guests invited to open Spello Hub, which was repaired and restocked after £250,000 was raised and hundreds of books were donated, including from the Queen. Our North of England correspondent Claire Fallon reports.
Rebuilding after the riots isn't only about fixing up damaged buildings. And so in Liverpool last night, to mark the reopening of a library smashed into and set alight in the summer, hundreds of people, plus a row of police. This is what they faced then, on a night 4 months ago of violent chaos, when this community's library was set on fire.
It was very distressing at the time. It's not normal for things like that to happen around here.
It was really sad when it happened.
No, but it's really nice. It's lovely that people are making the effort to come out.
I'd say surreal.
Do you like it?
Yeah, I like it.
What do you make of it?
I think it's fantastic. I think it's fantastic. It's really, don't mess with Liverpool.
It's great to see the library reopen, and so soon as well.
And so to today's big reopening at the Spello Hub Community Library, with new and donated books filling the shelves, and among the guests, the Children's Laureate Frank Cottrell-Boyce.
There's just something really medieval about burning a library down, isn't it? It's an assault on knowledge, assault on truth, but this one in particular, it's directly opposite a primary school. You know, it's an assault on children.
It just struck me last night with the parades, today with all of this going on, bearing in mind all the anger that was whipped by so much misinformation, that this feels like it's almost a reclaiming of a narrative.
Absolutely, it's absolutely that. A library, the bottom line is, a library is the repository of truth, and those riots were started by lies and by liars, you know, and this feels like the Alamo of truth, you know, so there's all that. You're exactly right.
Seeing those pictures of the books on the floor just made me feel so angry and upset. So all I set out to do was raise £500 to replace those books, nothing more.
The online fundraiser Alex set up did, though, raise a lot more. In all, $250,000 was donated.
And I think this just goes to show how much we value our libraries and our public spaces and how we need to fight for them, definitely.
Now, I would love to think that this is a change of the conversation because, yes, this library was burned, but 1,000 other libraries were closed by austerity, and they're all equal losses. And this one came back, and they're not coming back.
Lighting up the sky above Liverpool last night, the Spello Hub, even before the riots, was more than just a place to borrow books. The story now, it's open again, not just about the library that was torched, but about the library they rebuilt.
Claire Fallon there. Tonight's main news. Channel 4 News has been inside one of the factories at the heart of a drugs trade that turned Syria into a narco state. The rebels who ousted the regime are uncovering and dismantling the Captagon empire. It's estimated to have made more than $10 billion a year for the Assad family. Well, that's just about all we have time for this evening, but from the team in Syria and here in London, we're back at 7 tomorrow night. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Very good evening to you.
A change is brewing. Channel 4 weather, sponsored by DeLonghi Bean-to-Cup coffee machines.
Good evening. It's been cloudy and grey for most of us today, and that'll be the story tomorrow too. But on Saturday, most of us will see some sunshine, if only briefly. Now, here's the big picture from space from earlier, and much of the country shrouded in cloud, except for parts of Scotland where the sun has managed to break through. Tonight then, across England, Wales, Northern Ireland and southern parts of Scotland, it'll be cloudy with mist, murk and hill fog and a few spots of light rain and drizzle. But for northern Scotland, clear spells at times, and that will allow a few patches of fog to form by the end of the night. With skies clear in Scotland, down below freezing, frosty there, but for most of us, temperatures typically holding up at 3 to 6 degrees. So tomorrow across England and Wales, it's going to be a mostly cloudy day. The odd spot of light rain or drizzle, similarly so for southern Scotland. But for the rest of Scotland and Northern Ireland, bright for a while, but for a longer spell of rain will start to drift in from the northwest as the afternoon goes on. Here's the picture then in a bit more detail at 4 p.m. and bright at this stage of the day for Northern Ireland, but you can see the band of rain poised to sweep in from the northwest. Ahead of that for the Isle of Man and southeast Scotland, cloudy and grey skies, the odd spot of rain. Brighter for central Scotland, but the longer spell of rain already moving in across the Highlands and Islands. And it will be a chilly day tomorrow, temperatures at best around 7, maybe 8 degrees in 1 or 2 places. Now on Saturday across England and Wales, a cloudy and damp start, but skies will brighten through the day with many places seeing some spells of sunshine for the afternoon. But for Scotland and Northern Ireland, it's the other way round. After a dry, fine and chilly start, cloud will thicken through the day with the wind picking up, rain moving in and temperatures just a touch below where they should be for this time of year. Enjoy your evening. Take care. Goodbye.
Today's outlook may take a turn. Channel 4 weather, sponsored by DeLonghi Bean to Cup coffee machines.